Okay, let's move to the final problem set, which is a review of some Excel skills. And we are supposed to create a data set where we have country name and the World Bank code that comes by default, then the regional classification and the income classification, that's all in the metadata, and then we need GDP per capita and infant mortality rate, and we are downloading the data for the year 2020, and then we have to eliminate countries with incomplete observations. Okay, step one, we go to the WDI, which you see here to the right. First thing, we limit. You see we move from all to the 217 countries. So we only want the countries. We select them all. Then we go to the series. We download two series, GDP per capita, and then we search and get GDP, again we search GDP per capita, PPP, constant 2021. Actually it says current, so GDP per capita, PPP, current international dollars. Okay. Then the other one is the mortality rate. Let's search, and then it's mortality rate under 5, so we can limit by going to M, and then mortality rate, adult, under 5. So mortality rate under 5 per 1,000 live birth. Let's take this one. Then the time set 2020. Apply changes. Now, as we download the data, we go to advanced options, and we want to make sure that the data is a list, and we want the metadata as well. So now we download it. It's downloaded. Let's open an Excel sheet. Okay, so this is what it looks like. And so we enable editing. Sort to columns. So you see here's the data, here's the metadata, there's country metadata, footnotes, but here's our data. So what we need to do is, in a data set, each variable like GDP per capita or mortality rate, they need to have their own column. So what I do is I just highlight quickly the entire data set, and then I sort the data, because you can see that, you know, it's GDP per capita, mortality rate, GDP per capita. So let's sort by series name. So data, sort. My data has headers, correct? Series name, A to Z. Okay. And I don't really need this one, and I know the year is 2020, and I don't really need this one either. I can delete that because I know I downloaded it for the year 2020. Okay, but now you can see the first country is always Afghanistan. So now if we go down, we know there are 217 countries. Here is the next Afghanistan, and it is the same sequence as before for GDP per capita. So I just can cut this list and put it right next to here. So now I know that the first column is GDP per capita, but again I abbreviate that as Y. And the second column is infant mortality, which I also abbreviate. Okay. So now I don't need this anymore. I can delete that. And there is this overshoot where I cut the infant mortality information. Okay, so now the data set already looks a little bit nicer. And there's still some decimals that bother me a little bit. So let's just limit the decimals maybe to 1. Okay, make that bold. Okay, so those are the two quantitative variables, but you can see some countries have missing observations. So we are supposed to eliminate all the countries with missing observations. So let's do that, and I create a column, and I call it just miss obs. And then I enter an Excel formula, and I say equals if, and then I use or. And I say or, and it tells me if either this is equal to 2 dots, or this is equal to 2 dots, comma, then what you want to do, well then I want to give it a 1, otherwise I want to give it a 0. Okay, so there's now a 0, but here for American Samoa we should get a 1. So now I can copy down that formula. And indeed, whenever we see somewhere 2 dots, a missing observation, we get a 1. So now let's remove the formula. We know everywhere there's a formula like if or. Let's remove that. Control copy. It's just a good practice. Replace by values. And now we sort the data set according to that column miss observation. And we just push down the ones where we have the missing observations, and now we can delete them. Okay, so we still have some, I don't know, 188 observations or so. Okay, so now we have only full observations, and now I can also delete the column with the missing observations. Okay, so the next step we need to do is we need to add another column for the region and the income group. So I insert 2 columns, and here I will write region, and here inc group. Okay. So here we have the country code. So Afghanistan gets, for example, AFG. So now if we go to the country metadata, you can see, oh, Afghanistan is a low income group. So what we do is we just use another formula, which is VLOOKUP. We look up a value, and we tell Excel, look up the value, VLOOKUP. This value, where do you want to look it up? Well, here in the metadata. And I don't know, what's the first one, the income group or the region? Doesn't matter. So the income group is column 3, and this would be column 4. So now I highlight that. So now I have the array, but because I want to copy down the formula, I want to make sure that this array stays the same. So, and I do that by pressing for F4, so that there is the array fixed, the columns and the rows. Okay. So now the region, we said, was in the 4th column. And then we have to conclude the formula with a false, because let's say AFG wouldn't be there, then Excel would pull up the value from something similar, and of course this is something that we don't want. So we always conclude this command with false. So now here we should see now an entry. If we press enter but nothing happens, that is a Excel phenomenon that I noticed for the first time, I don't know, maybe a year ago or so. But if that happens, you enter a formula, nothing happens, it's because the cells are not formatted right. So just highlight everything, right click, format cells, and say general. Okay, and now do it again. Okay, now it says Middle East and North Africa. Okay, so now I can copy down that formula. And now we do the same thing for the income group. So we can take this formula, and I can copy down that formula to the right. But now I need to make a $sign in front of that B. I copy it to the right. But then the income group, that was in the third column. So I changed the column to 3. Okay, now I can copy this down. Now I fit everything to content. And now we have a nice, clean data set. Sometimes you still see here at the very bottom something that you also want to delete. And if you want to delete everything underneath, you just highlight everything below, press delete, and maybe you want to do that to the right too, so that there's not accidentally a cell filled. Okay, so now we have a nice data set, and we still have here the formulas in there. So I just highlight everything, control copy, and paste over itself the values, so that gets rid of all the formulas. Okay, so now we have the data set, and let's see again what we need to do. So create a column chart for the category regional classification. So a column chart for the regional classification, so we can use the pivot table first, and that gives us a frequency table. So we highlight. Theoretically, if you want to, you could highlight everything, it doesn't make a big difference. And then we go to insert, pivot table from table, table range, okay. And maybe I move myself here. Okay, so now I want the, what was it? So we want for the regional classification, okay. So we take the region into the rows. And then what we need is the frequency. So we can also put just the region into the value, and then you see we get the count. So that tells us we have a total of 188 countries, and 29 are in East Asia and the Pacific, and in Europe and Central Asia 51. And yeah, so now from this we can create a column chart. So I create a new sheet, and I call that column chart. Okay, so the pivot table is here in sheet 1. Maybe I renamed it pivot. Okay, so now we just copy everything into a new sheet, maybe here. And now we can write this, the frequency, and then the region. Okay. And now it's very straightforward. We could just create a column chart, and we go to Insert, Recommended Chart, and then we have a column chart. Just say OK. And now you can see it's a little bit all over the place. So what we want to do is maybe we want to sort by frequency from highest to lowest. So we go and sort the data, sort by frequency, largest to smallest, and now it looks a little bit nicer. Of course, we can now do the cumulative frequency if you want to. Cumulative frequency. So, of course, cumulatively, Europe and Central Asia is still 51. But then we always need to add to the previous the next frequency. And now we have the cumulative frequency. What we can do is we can do the percentage frequency. So I call it percentage and cumulative percentage, because then we can also create a Pareto chart. Cumulative percentage. Okay, so we have a total of 188. So I just need to divide everything by the total of 188. Of course, I can also type in 88, but okay. So now you can copy it down. The last one then, of course, must be the last one is the smallest. So it goes from 27% down to roughly 1%. And if we prefer the percentage, we can click here, maybe add a decimal. Now we can do the cumulative percentage. So cumulatively, Europe and Central Asia is still 27.1%. So now equals this plus that. And of course now the last category cumulatively needs to sum up to 100, otherwise we made a mistake. Okay, so now we could also do maybe a cumulative frequency table. So for that purpose we highlight frequency and the cumulative percentage, and then we go to Insert, Recommended Chart, and there is something, All Charts. We can go at the bottom, there's something called Combo, and yeah, the absolute frequency, actually I should have highlighted the region too. Recommended Chart. There it is already. So here we would have now a nice Pareto chart. Where we can see here the cumulative percentage of the various groups. So this would be a Pareto chart. But actually I don't know if that was even one of the questions. So create a column chart. That's what we did. And now, okay, we should have done a Pareto chart for the income classification. Okay, so now let's move to a pie chart for the income category. So we can go back again to our pivot table. And now we replace the region by the income group and the count of region by the income group. Okay, so there is one country which got the 0, which could be either Venezuela or Eritrea. And I'll just manually give them a income group. And so I have to go back to the data and just see, okay, here's a 0. It's actually Ethiopia. And I believe Ethiopia is a low income country. And then the next one, is there another one? Could be Venezuela. Okay. Let's see if there's another 0 anywhere. No. Okay, so that's it. So now we fix this one. Now if we go back to the pivot table and we do it again, it's still there. Income group. Okay. So maybe we have to delete that pivot table and start a new one. So let's highlight again everything. Insert pivot table. Okay. So now income group. Yeah. And again we call that pivot. Okay, so now we're supposed to do a pie chart, so we copy this information, we don't need a total, into maybe a new sheet. I call it pie chart. So we have here the income group, and here the frequency. Okay. So now we just highlight everything, and we can create now a pie chart. But you know, pie charts are not very popular because they are difficult to read. Comparing the pies, if they are not lined up, if you have to go look around in circles, it's just not as convenient. But we can add maybe the series name, not the series name, category name. But you see, it's just not as nice. So most people who work with data, they don't really like pie charts, but that's what it would look like. Let's call it pie chart. Okay, so now let's see what the other questions were. So create a Pareto chart for income classification. So now we need, again, the cumulative frequency. Okay. frequency and the cumulative frequency. But for a Pareto chart, what do we need to do first? We have to make sure the data is sorted from highest to lowest frequency. So we go to Data, Sort by Frequency, largest to smallest. So most of the countries are actually high income. And so the first one is, because we have 188 countries, again with the sun you can see we have 188 countries. So the cumulative frequency of the first one is equal to 63 divided by 188. And so that is 33%. So now I need to add to the 33% the percentage of the 53. And I can put there a dollar sign. Okay, now I should be able to just copy down that formula. And you can see the last category is indeed 1. And now I switch it to the percentage view. Maybe add. Okay. And now we can make a nice Pareto chart. Insert, recommended chart. Okay, so that would be the Pareto chart. Okay. So what is the next one? Create an absolute and percentage crosstab for the two categories, regional classification and income. Okay, so now we need to do a crosstab. I'll just complete this one. I call that pie chart and Pareto. So now the next one will be a crosstab. So now we use again the pivot table. So let's say I want to know, I want to have the region in the rows and the income group in the columns. So now I just can count them again. I can either put, I just can put anything into the values. And now I know in East Asia I have 8 high income countries, no low income countries, and yeah. So what I do is I just copy this one next. Into column that I call crosstab. First thing I do is I replace where there is a blank, I replace by zeros. Control F, replace nothing by a 0, replace all, okay, close. And then maybe let's format it a little bit nicer so that give it an it just looks a little bit nicer. Okay, so inside we have now the frequency, so we know now, Latin America and the Caribbean, there are 11 high income countries, and for upper middle income countries. If you want to, you could somehow sort this from high to upper middle to lower middle. So maybe you want to make it a little bit more like this. That could be done. And put okay, so now it's a little bit sorted. So that would be a crosstab in absolute terms. And if you want to know what percentage of high income countries are in East Asia and the Pacific, we just would take this and put it maybe next to it. And then we just use the formula. So then for each row, the grand total would obviously be always 100%. We will see that later. I don't really need, in the percentage, the column totals, they become nonsensical, so we can delete them. So we delete those. Okay. So now I can use a formula. The percentage of high income countries in East Asia is obviously 8 divided by the 29. So now if I want to copy that formula to the right, I need to anchor the H. So now that's like 27%. And now I can copy that to the right, and the sum is obviously 100%. So I can say the sum, that should be equal to 1. And now I just can copy down this formula and maybe just replace it by, okay. So now we know that in North America, 100% of all the countries are high income. In Europe and Central Asia, we have 64%, and so on. Okay, so this is a crosstab. Now let's see what the next question is. Okay, create a histogram for GDP per capita and infant mortality as well as the log. Okay, so let's go back to our data set and let's create a histogram so we can go right to the data and actually I just copied it quickly into a new sheet. Okay. Okay, so I call this histogram and scatter plot. Okay, so I just need these two columns. So now we said a histogram, we don't have to do it manually, we just use Excel. So we go to Insert, Recommended Chart, and then it's here. That's a histogram. Now let's cut that and put it a little bit on top. Okay, so this is a histogram of Y. And you can see the first, I don't know if you can see it, so those would be the data ranges, and maybe it gets rid of some of the decimal points here. So we can see the first range is from 958 to 13,958. And so that would be a histogram of y. And what you can see here is obviously that this is highly skewed to the right. Let's do the same with infant mortality. Highlight everything, insert, recommended chart. And again, we have a highly skewed histogram to the right, so both are skewed to the right. Okay, so this is histogram of infant mortality. Okay, so if I were now to create a scatter plot of those, where I say infant mortality depends on income, then from the earlier videos you should already, be worried a little bit that this probably doesn't look too nice. So let's see how a scatter plot looks like. So now if we do a scatter plot, insert, recommended chart, and still remember the first, in the array, the first variable is always on the x-axis. So now this is our scatter plot. Maybe let's make sure we can fit everything next to each other. And you see, this doesn't look too nice. So the nonlinearity that we have here in the histogram is mirrored in the nonlinearity here in the scatter plot. And if I put the trend line in there, you can see the trend line becomes again nonsensical, because countries that have an income of more than 60,000, they are predicted to have a negative infant mortality. And of course that doesn't make sense. So, and here in the mid-range, let's say between 20,000 and 40,000, the trend line, what we would predict, is always much higher than the actual values. So that's a bad trend line, and maybe something better is maybe such an exponential line, but then it becomes difficult to interpret. So whenever you work with data, what you typically want to avoid is dealing with nonlinearities. So how can we do that? And if you remember when we talked about it earlier, taking the log linearizes data. So we can create new columns, and now this time I take the natural log, ln y, and ln inf mortality. Okay, so the natural log has not the base of 10, but the base of e, and then we just say ln of this, and we copy that to the right, and now I copy it down, Control D. Okay, and then we get rid of some of the decimals here. Okay, so now let's take a look at the histogram for ln y. So insert, recommended chart. Okay, and you see this already looks much more normal. So this is histogram of ln y. You see, if you trace here the envelope, it already looks much more normal. So now let's take a look at infant mortality, insert, recommended chart. But that almost looks perfect. So now here we have the histogram of LN, infant mortality. So now we did our best to linearize the data. Let's delete those columns. And so now we can put here another scatter plot with the linearized data and see how that looks like. Insert recommended chart. And let's pull it up and let's put it underneath here. And now you can see that this looks much more linear. And I can actually, because there's no data between 0 and 6, which is the log of income, I just can format the axis and say start at 6. And now what you see is when I add the trend line, this is a nice straight trend line, which is obviously much better than the one that we saw up here. So that is why we often need to work with normal data, and why normality is important, and why we need to know about the distribution of data. So in this case, however, whenever you run a scatter plot where both variables are log transformations, then we call the trend line a basically double log regression, and the coefficient has to be interpreted differently. But that is something we can talk about later more when we talk about actually regression results. At this point, I just want to make sure you can visualize data and know about different kinds of data, how to visualize them, what the pitfalls are. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And in the next topic, we will just begin now with numerical descriptive statistics.